Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. On today's podcast, we have a very special guest. I was just searching his name on my notes, and I noticed that I had a list of people that I wanted to have on my podcast that I made a long time ago. And guess whose name was at the top of the list? Mark Mrohs. So finally, thank you so much, Mark Mrohs, for being here.
Wow, that's a compliment I haven't heard before. That's really good. Thank you so much, man. I'm happy to be here.
Oh man, I really do think that you're super, totally awesome, more than you even know. And maybe I'll just kind of talk about when I first ran into you. So in 2008, I was getting SunPower certified over in Richmond, California.
Yeah,
And you were in charge of that program, and you weren't the trainers in the class. And one of the trainers ended up becoming a good friend, is Chad Midcroft.
yeah.
And there's another guy with blonde hair who was really cool, and I'm sure you remember his name.
Chris Summerfield.
Yeah, that's right, Chris Summerfield. Yeah. And so I took their class, and I guess it was sort of your class because I think you put all the
I
material.
wrote the training manual, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and you were in charge of that. And
yeah,
then I did the online training for SunPower, and that was your voice, and that
right.
was you. And that was probably the first online class I ever took, 2008. And so I've learned a lot from you, a lot more than you probably know.
That's really cool to know. Yeah. That whole episode of SunPower for me was key in my whole life. If you look at a trajectory of your career, that would be the high point. Well, one of several, come on. But
Yeah.
I was there from 2005 to 2010, I believe. And that was the beginning of SunPower. They had made the cell, made it larger, it was all black, and they were just beginning to build a distribution network of dealers.
Well, the high point of my career is just talking to you right now.
Ah, okay, okay, okay. Thanks a lot.
Uh-huh.
So that trajectory was incredible. We had resources. It was my first introduction to Silicon Valley, right?
Uh-huh.
I've been in
Uh-huh.
solar, but Silicon Valley kind of came out in the 2000s. So I was exposed to the culture, the speed, the energy of Silicon Valley ventures, where they, would say things like, "We want to make money and do good to the world," or something like that. And
Uh-huh.
you were racing. So we created from scratch an entire training program around that module, and building up systems, built outdoor and indoor building facilities to mount arrays and modules. And it was just probably the most exciting time. It continues to be, and we all know that SunPower has now gone through a weird trajectory, but back then it was fun to be on the front edge. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's too bad that SunPower has been on that trajectory. And it's also interesting to me how a company like that can sort of divide up, and there's still SunPower in Europe, and there's Maxion manufacturing their modules. And it's just strange how that kind of thing works. And I was thinking that probably the reason that some of these companies go down is their CEOs don't know as much as somebody that takes a NABCEP associate class.
Yeah. No, for sure. I was going to say, look to top management and see, what their incentives are. If is it a stock buyback? Is it a move to another company in 6 months? There are non-business related targets that lead companies way different than you'd think they should be.
Yeah.
I haven't been experienced the downfall of SunPower in person there now, but I did experience Sun Edison's flight. They rose and they crashed.
Yeah, I remember having a good conversation with you when you were working for Sun Edison. It was like somewhere, I'm trying to think of where that was. It was at this office building not too far from the San Francisco airport.
Yeah, it's right up on the Bay Area, right up on the west coast of the Bay.
Yeah, and you invited me over there, and it was after you were working for this company doing this PVT, PV and thermal.
Right, exactly. Echo Solar. Echo Solar. What a weird name, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, the solar thermal and PV combined.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Is that why you had to say it twice? Echo Solar, Echo Solar.
There was some marketing involved that had strong opinions.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so then I guess like Sun Edison bought all these companies and things
Sun
like
Edison
that.
was buying up people. It was, all the smartest guys in the room once again, like we've seen before, and they grew financially way beyond their britches. But it was exciting because there was another sort of SunPower opportunity in terms of a company that wanted to do it differently. They were making their own bead silicon feedstock,
Mm-hmm.
growing their own crystals, making their own cells and modules. We were making our own microinverters. We were looking at making our own frames. I mean, it was an integrated effort that could have worked, but they financially strapped it out.
Yeah, and do you think there's some analogies between Sun Edison and what happened recently to SunPower? Like, do you think in
Oh,
both companies the person in charge couldn't pass the NABCEP associate exam?
yeah. No, in the case of Sun Edison, there was some smarts there about solar.
Uh-huh, I'm
That was
sure.
overtaken by greed. That was financial, you know, rose-colored glasses,
Uh-huh.
saying we can
Yep.
expand by 400% per year kind of
Mm-hmm.
things. You
Yep.
can't sustain that.
Wow. Crazy. Okay. So one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about is just like it's so interesting some of the things that you told me about. And so I think too, like in our past, that you called me a couple of different times and talked to me about joining, maybe it was SunPower. For some reason, I think I was talking to you when you were at SunPower. And I remember I was teaching a class in Canada. Actually, it was for Mohawks. And I took some extra time and talked to you on the phone. And then another time over there at Sun Edison. And I guess, I probably should have joined you, but I'm just such an entrepreneur. I have a phobia of working for other people.
Yeah, right. You've said that before. Yeah, that's true. We'll go with that for sure.
And so when we were talking in Sun Edison, you were telling me a lot of this really cool, I think that's where the conversation was. I'm not sure. I know I've seen you in a lot of different places, but I think you were telling me like just like a lot of really super cool stories that I was just like, man, this guy should write a book. This stuff is so interesting. And I remember it was like how you were doing solar cells when people were like terrestrial solar, that means solar that's not in space. That would be a pipe dream.
Oh, for
And
sure. Oh, yeah, yeah. No, we can go back to the beginning. It's really kind of fun now.
okay, time travel, back to the beginning.
I've been doing solar cells for 50 years.
Wow.
I started in 74.
It's 1974. So that's when NorCal Solar started, which was just all about solar thermal and stuff
No,
like that.
no. There was no terrestrial PV at that time.
Yeah, 1954 was when Bell Labs first came up with the thing that looked like a solar module.
Right.
And you see pictures of it. Have you ever seen one of those?
No, I haven't, and I wish I could. Yeah, no, but I've seen the pictures.
Yeah, maybe they made just a few of them because I'm
Yeah.
surprised that nobody has one in a museum somewhere.
Probably somewhere. Or maybe
Uh,
Charlie Gay has one tucked away somewhere at the Smithsonian.
we'll have to ask them.
But the idea is that I went to Harvey Mudd College, which is one of the Claremont colleges, got a physics degree, graduated in 74. And my first full-time post-collegiate job was being an engineer at Spectrolab, which was in Sylmar, which is where I lived in the northern San Fernando Valley.
And they're still around because I looked them up on the internet and it's a Boeing company right now.
Yeah.
And they're making the space cells, and you'll see things that are like 40% efficient,
Yeah.
concentrated solar cells. And I remember calling them up before and asking how much it costs. And they're like, you need government clearance to talk to us.
Yeah. No, for
Uh,
sure.
uh-huh,
It's in a different world. It's a
uh-huh.
completely different product, let's consider it. So I grew up in Sylmar, which is at the very northern edge of the San Fernando Valley. And I had actually worked there in the summer of 73 as an intern while going to college during summer break. I worked in the R&D department.
You were working at a solar company in 73.
Right, R&D, making space solar cells.
So that's 51 years.
There you go. I tacked on, well, that's a summer, add a summer in there.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And so
That still counts.
that was very cool. I was this, little spritzy new guy out of college. It's the first place that I met Charlie Gay, who's a
Uh-huh.
critical part of this entire solar industry.
Yeah, so
Um,
he's really famous. I remember him being keynote speaker a number of times. And what he ran InRel, I guess.
Correct, exactly. Yeah. So I forget the dates, but let's say I joined them in, June or July of 73. Charlie was hired right
Hmm.
then, I don't know, within the same week or something like that. So here I am, this sparky little bachelor degree physics guy working with a PhD in physical chemistry. It was pretty cool. So that's where I and Charlie Gay go all the way back that whole time.
So I was going to ask you if you knew anybody that's been in the industry longer than you, but I guess Charlie Gay.
That certainly comes to mind. There are
Uh,
others, I would have to imagine, but it all comes from the space industry, if that's longer. So all the folks that are currently involved in terrestrial solar would
mhm.
have to wait until, the late 70s, maybe the early 80s to count their years. Yeah.
Wow. So what were you doing in 1973?
Yeah, we were making very thin solar cells. So it's like I said, it's a different world, same conversion process and all that wonderful stuff. But the idea is that your goal is not low cost energy. Your goal is lightweight and high
Hmm.
efficiency.
Hmm.
Damned be the cost.
Uh-huh.
So we were making 1 mil thick solar cells, so thousandth of an inch thin, the
Uh-huh.
whole cell, and just trying different ways to make a single junction solar cell more efficient.
So what were you making like the front contacts out of? Were you just like soldering things or?
Silver, actually
Hmm.
3 layers, probably silver, palladium, titanium, something like that. And these were not printed on like we do now, low cost for terrestrial, but
Hmm.
they were sputtered on. So you'd put a fixed number of cells in masks behind very thin masks that had very, very thin lines in them. And then you'd put those in a chamber, pull a vacuum, shoot an electron beam, hit some silver or titanium or palladium or whatever it is you're using, and blast it up, and it would go only where the grooves were. So that then when you took the cell out, you had this cell with maybe, 1 mil or half a mil thick grid lines on it.
Wow.
They wanted to maximize the efficiency. Yeah.
So like I remember hearing about them taking silkscreen machines like for t-shirts and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's interesting because working at Spectrolab, that's really a source location. It's very lucky for me to have been there because that's where Bill Yerkes worked.
Hmm.
So Bill Yerkes was the head of the Spectrolab space cell manufacturing. But Bill Yerkes was a key element in the history of solar in the United States. He was a pioneer in terms of thinking about low cost terrestrial modules when nobody would consider it. Everyone thought, oh, these are going to always be too expensive. Well, partly it's because of how they were made, right? The purity of the material used, the putting on of the grid lines, the method of encapsulating in a module, all that stuff he re engineered into
Hmm.
what is basically the kind of module we have today, a glass front, plastic back module with screen printed grid contacts, that all, and sodium hydroxide coated or etched fronts, so you have a double pyramid surface. All of that came out of, like, as far as I'm concerned, the work that we were directed to do under Yerkes at Spectrolab. So the current terrestrial type of cell and module was envisioned in the mid 70s there.
What would you say the difference is between the sputtering and the silkscreen way of doing things?
Well, a factor of 1,000 in terms of
Uh,
cost,
uh-huh.
something like
Yeah,
that.
what did you say? You're like shooting an electron beam at something?
Yes, exactly. In a vacuum chamber,
Wow.
you have a tip that can eject under high voltage electrons, then you have magnetic fields that bend it. And think of this thing as like being a laser beam that gets bent 180 degrees or whatever, and then lands on a pot of, let's say, silver. And the electrons just knock the silver out of its liquid form into a gaseous form, and the gas just coats everything. So you lose most of it, and you're just making these very thin grid lines.
And is there any benefit to doing it that way versus the way that
You
they
get
do it now?
super, super thin, super tall grid lines. So you want to
Yeah.
conduct the current, so you want thick wires, but you don't want them very wide. So you make them super thin, but then you make them kind of tall.
Wow. Do you remember like some years back, there was some project that was being worked on by Bill Nye, the science guy, or he was promoting it, where they were going
Yeah.
to slice solar wafers out of the ingots with electron beams?
I'm not familiar with that particular thing. I can imagine there have been lots of thoughts about how to do it. What we settle on now is wire saws, which keeps a uniform sort of cut, and we've done it now for decades, and there's probably reasons why. If you try to cut through, 6 inches or 8 inches of silicon, you can imagine, a Marvel movie where it's pretty well melted and pulverized.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
everyone's settled on wire saws, and that's the way we do it.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the company, but I would go watch the videos and show them to classes once in a while with Bill Nye, the science guy with the bow tie, talking about this new technology where they're going to make the wafers even thinner with like an electron particle beam or some kind of crazy thing like
I
that.
guess it didn't work out.
Yeah, not yet. But so you've just seen so many things happening in the industry. So you start off there, and then were you making solar cells at Spectrolab? Like that was your job?
That's the idea. Yeah, like say 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter or 2 centimeter by 6 centimeter. They're small. That's the size of the cell that goes on the satellites.
And would you just be sitting there at a desk,
No, I'd be working in a lab.
at a lab with a centimeter by 2 centimeter?
Imagine seeing, white coated mask wearing people, technicians, walking between machines that are either growing crystals or slicing them or coating them or putting on AR coatings. It was a factory lab. Yeah.
So what do you think the price per kilowatt hour was there? Like your levelized cost of energy, like $1,000 per kilowatt hour?
Cost per watt, maybe, 200, 300
Uh-huh.
for cells, something like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's a
What it is
different
now.
particle. It's like, talking about laser beams and spoons.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard that if you look up at the space station, you see gallium arsenide solar cells. Were you involved in making?
No, I wasn't. They moved to gallium arsenide after I left Spectrolab. I basically took off. Very interesting, important part of my life. I saved up some money and I took off from the United States and lived in France and Paris for a year and a half. I was changing my career in a sense. I was going to go more into theater, pantomime, physical movement theater.
Hmm.
Studied at Jacques Lecoq School of Movement in Paris. I lived in a condemned apartment building on the outskirts of Paris in a suburb with four other students from the same school. A very bohemian existence there.
So you sounded like you were sort of a French hippie.
100% exact.
All right.
And so I broke away and did that. My father was going to get remarried, so that brought me back for that event. I was going to just stay, and my career would have been completely different. But
Uh-huh.
I came back and I visited old friends, and many people at Spectrolab had left and started Arco Solar.
Uh-huh. You were working at Arco Solar.
Right, exactly. Under Bill Yerkes, Charlie Gay, a bunch of other people. So that was the beginning of Arco Solar, and that's, a keystone beginning of the terrestrial market.
Uh-huh.
So I think I joined there, let's say, end of 78, maybe 79. And people were really concerned about pollution. This was the launch of Earth Day and all that kind of stuff. So at that time, we weren't so concerned about global climate warming. We were worried about pollution and solar as a way to make energy instead of polluting the skies. So we had our marching orders pretty early, but consider, visions of making utility scale power plants in the desert, making BIPV modules that just sort of nail onto your roof. All these visions were at that time very clear to us. It's just taken us a few decades to kick ass.
So were you involved with that project on the Carrizo Plains that was kind of
I wasn't
famous?
personally involved. No, that was mostly engineering. I was
Hmm.
involved in manufacturing
Uh-huh.
mostly, and then training, making videos. But no, the Carrizo Plane project was an example of a forward vision lurking, all the smart guys in the room, but making good choices. Arco, or Atlantic Richfield at that time, had talked about becoming not just a oil company, but let's say a natural resource company. And they had visions at the very top that led them to be able to invest in solar. So the vision of making a utility scale power plant was way ahead of its time, right? But
Yeah.
things have to have beginnings, right? From small beginnings come great things.
So what percentage of the industry do you think of terrestrial solar at that time was in California?
Oh, it's hard to say. I don't know how much business was done by solar power.
Like I would imagine it was probably most of it, most of the whole world.
I was going to say 50% to try and be
Hmm.
fair with not knowing the right answer.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But yeah, we were
Yeah.
kind of the center of the universe. The Arco module was referred to as an Arco. If you go to like
Hmm.
Africa or someplace where we had distributors, people
Uh-huh.
would come in and they'd say, I want an Arco,
Uh-huh.
like I want a
Yeah.
Kleenex.
I have some. They're super awesome. Do you know Matt Pace?
I can't recall right now.
He's a guy that helps write codes and standards, and right now he's in batteries. And he was a fire chief, and I'm probably going to have him on the podcast pretty soon. And he said he was soldering some Arco cells together back in the day, but I know it's not as early as you were, but he was probably, I guess he was a teenager.
Oh, just doing it himself. My gosh.
No, no, he was working for Arco Solar, I think like right when he finished high school or something like
Okay.
that.
It'd be interesting to get clarity on the year of that and so on. There was always a push for mechanization, so there wasn't a lot of hand soldering of stuff. You couldn't do that and make a decent product. But there was some like connection. We'd use machines to string together the cells to make
Uh-huh.
individual strings of 10 or 11 or 12 cells. But then there'd be hand soldering probably of the bus bar at the top and the bottom of the module to connect. Maybe he was involved in that. That's cool, yeah. I was there in 1980 when Arco Solar, by probably December 31st at almost midnight, had produced 1 megawatt of solar in 1 year.
Wow. Uh-huh.
That was a milestone for the industry.
1 megawatt in 1 year. What a milestone. And now that's like 5 minutes for some of these factories, I
Exactly.
guess. Yeah.
That's where we've come. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, yeah, I was even thinking about the cost of electricity from solar has gone maybe from something like $1,000 per kilowatt hour to 1 cent per kilowatt hour in some projects.
Yeah. But it's incredible how people are still misinformed. And a lot of that comes from deliberate misinformation from people against solar. Some of it comes from just people not, being lazy about staying current of what's going on. They'll say, a module never gives back all the energy that it took to make it. So what's the
Yeah.
point? That kind of thing. And you could go, no, it's like a third of a year or something like that. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
we're still facing frustrations, even though we're taking off.
Yeah, I hear that one every once in a while. And it was like, I remember like Rush Limbaugh was saying that. And it's like, well, maybe there is some solar module that somebody didn't use that,
Yeah.
do have to put it in the sun.
No, 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 no. Yeah, no. So we still face that problem. So if we go back to history and trajectory and stuff, so I was at Arco Solar, and then that got sold. So the visionary people at Atlantic Richfield left or moved on, and it was taken back over by Texas oil men. So Arco retrenched itself from the sort of the energy market back into petroleum and sold us to Siemens. So that's the origin of Siemens Solar, still in
Uh-huh.
Camarillo, California.
Uh-huh.
So I worked 10 years at Arco Solar and then 10 more years at Siemens Solar,
Wow.
running training programs. And that was in the 80s, and that was the big travel time for me. In my career now, I've probably visited 26 countries, most all of that because of work travel. And that was a super exciting time. We were building a network of US and international dealers and distributors all over the world.
Uh-huh. And so in my classes, sometimes I teach about safety and things like that. And we were talking about fall protection and things like that. And you had some story, and I can't remember exactly how it goes, about cannibals being the safety issue.
Oh, okay, let me go back a bit. That's making it pretty dramatic. So,
Yeah, and if cannibals are a problem, do you still need fall protection? Because I think you need to be able to get away quick.
oh, 100%. So I think that comes from conversations about when I was at Arco Solar. So this is the late 70s, very early 80s. And Papua New Guinea, which is half of the island that's north of Australia, Papua
Uh-huh.
New Guinea was a real hotbed for photovoltaics. This would be industrial applications for telecommunication towers because Papua New Guinea is the place where Margaret Mead did a lot of her research, and there are probably 700 different languages and
Yeah.
700 different cultures because it's so mountainous that people just don't move. It's too hard to get very far once you get away from the coast.
Yeah, I've read about every one of Jared Diamond's books. Have you read his books?
No, I haven't. No.
But he was an avian biologist and he was studying in Papua New Guinea. And then he started getting more interested in human culture and the Stone Age and just with all these different independent Stone Age civilizations, some of them at the time when he was there, they hadn't had contact even or just barely making first contact. And so he could kind of see how they operated and how they would treat one each other and what they would do if a stranger came and some of the different reasons why they wouldn't move because they could get killed. It was dangerous.
That's fascinating. It's a beautiful, fascinating place. So I was there with Peter Mackenzie, who's
Uh-huh.
another key element of the early history and support of the entire solar industry. He worked at Arco Solar and Siemens Solar and then went on to other companies as a master salesman. But I traveled over to Papua New Guinea. So here I am, this, 28-year-old kid, and I was into video at that time, video for the company. And I'm flying in a helicopter being piloted by an Australian bush pilot, probably recently out of Vietnam, who, enjoyed flying at treetop and trying to scare the kid in the back. They took the door off the helicopter so that I
Uh-huh.
could take video right out of it. So I was strapped in my seat, but it felt like I was hearing the Flight of the Valkyrie music, dun da da dun, da, as I'm flying over uncharted jungle. And every once in a while, you'd fly over a clearing, and that would be a village. and
Uh-huh.
you'd be looking down at them and they'd be looking up at you. So I definitely wanted to be
And
strapped
that
in.
you were some god in this metal machine and they didn't even know what metal was.
Who
Huh.
knows? It would have been interesting to be down there as well. Yeah. So what was interesting too, you do stuff like this in remote areas. A lot of us are used to residential, either, urban or suburban, some remote buildings in the mountains. But when you're dealing with remote telecommunication relay towers, hundreds of miles from anybody, up on the top of a mountain in Papua New Guinea, we'd fly in and we'd try to get there early because this dense, sort of white, cloudy layer was down in the valleys below you. But as the morning progressed and it got warmer, that cloud bank was rising. You could actually see it. And if you stayed there too long, you'd be socked in and wouldn't be able to fly, possibly for days, depending on the weather. So it was a scramble to get some work done. You wanted to repair something or check something, climb on the array, do some work. But as quickly as you could, get done, get back into the helicopter and get out of there before the cloud bank caught you. And on one of my trips doing this work, on the way home, the couple of the solar guys who lived in Papua New Guinea were saying, hey, let's get some fresh crab for, crab on the barbie tonight. And the pilot would take the helicopter to a village and just land in the middle of the village. You can imagine, it's not a landing strip. There's dirt everywhere, kicks up a bunch of dirt, but he just lands his helicopter right in the middle of the village, open area. And these folks come out, and don't think of this as being like cannibals with bones in their noses or something like that. This is all,
No,
folks wearing.
nothing against them.
No, no, no. I'm just saying it's all folks wearing Western clothing and stuff like that.
Sure.
But from the helicopter, he's bargaining with them. They run out there with, fruits and vegetables and crabs and shrimp and stuff. And he negotiates with them. And eventually I got out to do some video shooting. So I'm shooting villagers while they're looking at me going, why the hell did you land in the middle of our village? And then when we were done and took off, he had a bag of crabs in the helicopter. And as we're heading on home, the crabs get out of the bag and start climbing around inside the helicopter cockpit. So it got a little antsy there for a while. But that's the kind of stuff that's peripheral to doing solar that just makes it an incredible career.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Wow, that's pretty awesome. Is any of that footage still exist?
I have my own versions on my YouTube channel that are, old VHS. Can imagine 1980
Uh-huh.
VHS quality edited together. So not everything
Hmm.
that I did there, but a few would give a sense of, what it was like to be back there at that time.
Wow, I'm going to go check that out and maybe I could leave a link on the show notes for that. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. And so about the cannibals.
Well, I never met one. If we talked about it, it was just the fact that I was this kid, strapped in the side of a helicopter, flying over people that were,
Oh, huh.
thousands of years away from my technology. And I was putting in solar modules. So there's, effectively 20th, 21st century technology going into countries where, like you said, many are living in the Stone Age. The
Yeah.
juxtaposition of it is just so remarkable.
Yeah. I read a lot of these Jared Diamond books. Like, have you ever heard of the book Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Yes.
That's the one he's famous for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's a ton of New Guinea references, and I often listen to it as I'm falling asleep and things like that.
Yeah.
So you went to all these different countries and you were installing solar and teaching
Yeah.
people how to do it. And was it all just all different types of systems? You said telecommunications, and that was probably, before there were cell phones. So it was just some sort of repeaters and things like that, I
Right.
guess.
Exactly. Linking cities or fire stations and so on. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Or land-based telephones. Yeah.
Were you setting up like microwaves or anything like that? Microwave
That work was
dishes?
all done by another company. So the solar was an adjunct to the larger thing, which was setting up the telecommunication tower with its backup generators and all that stuff. And I'm talking about like the contractors in Papua New Guinea run by these Australian guys who would be installing the solar arrays as the towers were being built.
Great. Yeah, I remember doing some classes for some telecom companies in Islamabad. And it was Islamabad's a modern city. It didn't seem as scary as it sounds, even though I was, I think, 20 miles away from where the bin Laden compound was. But one of the times I was asking them, like, well, why are you doing this with your batteries? You could make them last a lot longer and all this stuff. And the one guy was saying, like, well, if we did that, then the Taliban would just steal our batteries. So
Yeah,
you
see, got to think about things. Yeah.
so you have to, in your system sizing, there needs to be a chart for things like Taliban, cannibals, and nothing against different
It's interesting that
cultures.
you bring up that work in that part of the world. I did travel to and do trainings in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, other areas around there, Oman. But I wanted to mention that when I moved on from Arco Solar, which then became Siemens Solar,
Siemens is a giant German multinational,
yeah, think of it as being like Hughes or think of them as being like GE. Yeah,
and they invented the Siemens reactor, which is how we refine silicon.
exactly. But that was for semiconductor industry. Wasn't having to do with solar, but we took it over. That's for
Uh-huh.
sure. But
Yep.
what happened then was Siemens is international and India at this time. So this is around 1990 to 1994. India was wanting to really get into solar, and there was Tata BP Solar over there already. But you can imagine the potential is incredible. So an agency called IREDA, IREDA, the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, put out a bid in conjunction with the World Bank. And this goes back to people like Mark Fitzgerald, which you may know or know about. Mark Fitzgerald started what is now SSP and what spawned off in the US to be NABCEP.
Wow. So SSP became NABCEP?
SSP is like an umbrella organization, international,
Uh-huh.
which would license out the rights to certify the quality of solar technicians. The idea was that at this time, solar was being used a lot for rural electrification, a lot of water pumps, maybe some lighting, and so on, in very developing countries. And the failure rates were very high. That's not good. So we know that the product itself is, low maintenance and can work forever. But if it's poorly installed or poorly maintained or people eat through the wires or whatever, these systems were failing. And organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and things like that were interested in funding solar, but not interested in having their projects fail. And so there was pressure to do technician training and improve the quality of people because a lot of times the attitude there might be, we'll just replace it. We won't
Mm-hmm.
fix it. Or there's no need to put it in really correctly at first because labor is so cheap and so on. We'll just go back and fix it all the time. So that attitude made the reliability of solar, quote unquote, unreliable. So what happened was IREDA put out an RFP for a multi-year technician training program for India. And Siemens Solar won it. I helped write it and we won it. And I ran the program as well as conducted classes in India for 3 years.
Wow. So were you living in India?
I would travel there for the courses, so maybe 2, sometimes 3 weeks in a row.
Okay, great.
And I worked with a few other trainers so we could offer multiple classes in a year. I went once a year, they each went once a year. And this would be a 1 week long training program. What was very cool is that Siemens, being very high end, wanted prestige from this program. And another group that was willing to want to go after prestige was the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology. That's like our MIT.
Uh-huh.
They have a number of them. If you go to an IIT, you've gone to the best, engineering school in all of India. And I partnered initially with 3 of them, one in Delhi, one in Mumbai, one in Bombay. It turned out that the truth of the matter is whenever you do a project, you need a champion. You need a human champion in the partner that you're working with who is in it for the long run and interested and willing to work with you. It can't be someone who's doing 10 other things and doesn't care. And it turned out that at this one IIT in Madras, there was already a technician training program, but for the equipment that was needed by the professors at the university. So this was run by an electronic engineering professor, and he had a team of technicians and facilities and room and tables and so on, but already, mentally attuned to the importance of having highly trained technicians. So I was able to couple with him, and for 3 years, we were able to offer this program at one of the highest institutes of learning in India, and there'd be technicians that wanted to become solar technicians from around India that would come to the class.
Wow.
And that was really transformative for me because not only was it cool to run a program so intense, starting from A, ending in Z, teaching them everything about solar, because you can imagine they would have to make everything. Racking, they wanted to make their own modules, batteries, inverters, whatever. But it was a chance to get semi-immersed in the Indian culture, which is diverse, depends on where you are in India. But the point is, it's really different from a Southern California boy growing up in American culture.
Uh-huh.
And there's a lot of poverty, and you have to face it right in front of your face. And for me, it was a very enlightening period because you're working with these very smart, very educated people, but they're very spiritual in the sense that they don't just go to church on Sundays, right? I mean, it permeates life for them. And, being rich, being poor, being alive, being dead, how life twists and turns on you, that was all just sort of a part of the breeze of life, a part of the river of life. It was really interesting to spend time in a country that different. Yeah.
Wow. Wow, neat. Yeah, I've spent a little bit of time there doing some classes at intersolar conferences,
Yeah.
but nothing like what you've done. But
No, because
that's,
you stay there for a while. I mean, you need to live there for years to say you've, been to India. But for at least weeks, you're staying in some housing that's not a hotel. Sometimes I would sleep on the floor. I mean, it depends on how I was put up, but, with blankets and comfort. But every day you'd eat with the classmates. Every night you'd go out just in the streets and eat from not so much fancy restaurants. You'd eat out on the street with all the cows and the motor scooters running by. You could be more a part of the life.
uh-huh, great, great. Did you do yoga when you were there?
No,
Uh-huh.
no, it wasn't into that at that time. No.
Yeah, or they just call it the yoga of life, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Like it's not just the stretching part of yoga.
Yeah, no, no, no.
Uh-huh.
And
Wow.
then from spending time with Siemens Solar, and the Indian program was probably the highlight for me of all that time, but ran a lot of training classes for a lot of distributors and dealers on solar at that time. So I changed over and joined AstroPower.
Astropower.
Yes. And so I followed Peter Aschenbrenner, who had been at Arco Solar and Siemens Solar, and then left and joined AstroPower. He enticed me to come on over because they, just like SunPower, they had a certain kind of cell that they were making from rejected semiconductor wafers. There might be reasons for, the entire 8-inch wafer or whatever to be rejected. There were tons of those. And this whole company, AstroPower, was made based on the premise that you could strip off the circuits off the top and make them into solar cells. And AstroPower was really key. That's where the idea of a shingle module was basically invented for the US. These were like 2-cell wide strips that were framed and you would mount them directly to the roof. It was a BIPV type of approach. And that was being done in early 2000.
Wow. Okay.
So it was very innovative at that time and very cool.
And then I know when you said too you were working at Arco and Siemens, I believe there's like a family tree, and that lineage is now perhaps Maxion. Like it
Yeah.
went through Shell and all these different names and Solar World. And I remember going to some solar conferences when Solar World was doing well, and they had on their booth like this big long history, and then Solar World closed down, and then SunPower bought them up, and then SunPower, what's left of it is Maxion producing solar cells. So it's sort
Yeah.
of like that lineage is still there.
Yeah. It's a tree, it's a branch because the input from Siemens Solar was a carryover from Arco Solar. So that's a root, drawn from the very beginning. But to
Huh.
mix it in with anything from SunPower is to mix the original, Bill Yerke's approach to making very cheap modules for the Earth with Silicon Valley.
Uh-huh.
And SunPower brought a completely different technology and energy to the industry. And so for them to be in sort of the same stream is kind of an interesting conjunction of two rivers coming together.
Huh. Wow. Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what else I was thinking is just since you've been at it for so long, for 50 years or 51 years, depending on how you count, that most of the time that you've been doing solar has been off grid. That grid connected solar, oh, it's this new thing.
Yeah, let's think about this. It's interesting to look at the whole trajectory. I have sort of a big picture sense from my perspective of having gone through the industry from its very start. The revolution, I could go back, but the real revolution in getting grid connected was grid connected inverters.
Uh-huh.
That was the breakthrough. And that, when I look at the trajectory of the entire solar industry, I start, with space solar cells, and then with Arco Solar and Solar Power Corporation and a few others back then in the late 70s. We started taking either rejected wafers from the space industry or whatever and putting them into a laminate that had maybe a glass or plastic front, maybe even a metal back, and making modules for like water pumping and so on here. And then we got into Arco Solar making the 162,000 and the M53 and 55 and so on, these sort of regular modules that you would recognize today. The center of the universe of the solar world was the module. That was the center of the universe. And the module manufacturers, therefore, were the focus and the king and queen and the darling of the industry. You could maybe make your own inverter, you could maybe, get some batteries, make your own frames, but you couldn't make your own modules. So the module was the center of the universe in the late 70s and into the mid 80s. But then with the election of the Green Party in Germany in the early 80s, they, among many other things, really promoted strongly the subsidizing of the solar industry in Germany. And that took off, right? The subsidies were so incredible. Farmers and homeowners would be making money by putting solar on their roofs. And that was made possible by the development of grid-tied inverters, bidirectional inverters.
Yeah. And we did have Ike Weber on the podcast for Hermann Scher's 80th birthday. So I'm thinking of Hermann Scher when you're talking about German. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. The Fraunhofer Institute and everything. I mean, there was a national effort for years to explode solar, and that's exactly what happened. So now, during that period, let's say the mid and late 80s, into the 90s, of course, the center of the universe had become the inverter. There was intelligence being built in. Certainly, it could talk to the grid. Some were able to draw from batteries. The whole idea, when I was at AstroPower, this is in 98, 99, we were coming up on 2000, the millennial change that was going to throw us back into the cave world because all the computers were going to fail. We started making solar UPS systems. And for like 20 years, I've had one on my house where we had modules, inverters, and batteries. And the system would work with the grid, but if the grid went down, it would draw upon its own batteries. That sounds pretty familiar, but we were doing that in like 98.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and I'm sure you know Ward Bauer, who
yes.
invented the grid tie inverter in 77.
Well, yeah.
And
yes,
he's also on my list.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Got to get him. So the idea, though, is that what I'm saying is the center of the universe of the solar world was now around the inverter. Modules were, of course, important, but it was the inverter that was the focus of growth and attention and capability. And then in the 90s, I forget my timeline now exactly, right? But you had people like Elon Musk's cousins.
Oh, the Reeve brothers. And I think that was
yeah,
more
what was their company?
Solar City, but I think that was more like in the mid 2000 and
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Or something like
so
that. Yeah.
With the rise of entrepreneurial people getting involved and Silicon Valley getting involved, starting in the mid 2000s, that I was at SunPower from 2005 to 2010. So with those changes, the center of the universe shifted to financial mechanisms, financial engineering, as opposed to module engineering or inverter engineering. It was now financial engineering that was driving the industry. The invention of leases, power purchase agreements, things like this. This was all new invention then. And the financial focus took over, right? And doing leases and so on allowed solar to be more affordable initially to a lot of people. So the domestic market really started, again, taking off because of this third major evolutionary step. Now, that financial revolution, let's say, with leasing has run its course. And now I think we're in a different phase, which I would call the interoperability. So now the center of the universe of the industry is utilities putting in gigawatts of solar. That's happening all the time. And with our codes and standards changing, to have greater interoperability so that we can have demand-side management and draw from, thousands of residential inverters off their, lithium-ion batteries if a utility needs more power for a few hours. That's a whole different world of focus. So it's kind of like the fourth center of the universe stage. That's my big picture kind of how we've evolved over 50 years.
That's a great way of zooming out and looking at things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun for me to think that way because, I'm a solar cell guy and a solar module manufacturing background guy. So it's like, oh, you love the module and I love the technology and so on. But I'm willing to consider the fact that other elements of this industry and this, technical solution that we offer, other elements besides the module and the cell have been critical to our growth and how it's been handed off to different kinds of people and different kinds of technological needs. But it's pretty exciting where we are right now.
Yeah, and when you talk about the interoperability, I guess that would mean like virtual power plants and solar with storage and load control and
exactly.
source control and lots of CTs and software connecting everything together. And then perhaps there needs to be something political in there too, like the public utilities commissions have to be okay with some of these things that just make a lot of sense. And
I think that's a stage still to come. All these, regulatory issues kind of have to be pushed. The technology has to become badass enough to push. Now
uh-huh,
at least we're badass enough to be where we are. But we are seeing, for example, in California, my state, my
yeah,
lovely solar proactive state is becoming so regressive in its approach to residential solar. It's, you know, it makes me cry. We are still fighting overall utility infrastructure integration. And for the life of me, it is so frustrating to, imagine that we're dealing with heads of companies that still resist the integration of solar in the most positive way into the grid instead of making it the most impossible thing to do and then having to fight every inch of the way. So I think that true sort of utility infrastructure integration of this technology is still to come.
yeah. And the one thing that I don't like about how the policy changes is when they make huge jumps, like from the net metering 2 to net metering 3, if you can call it net metering.
That's a huge step back, yeah.
Yeah, instead of little gradual jumps that would incentivize batteries or something like that, it's just not good to have like a policy that's, double the return on investment time or something like that just overnight to make a change
No,
like that.
I mean, obviously, with our political and social situation, we're dealing with a lot of pushback. There's a lot that's changing in the world, technical, social, everything, right? There's a lot of people that don't like change, don't want change, can't afford change. Maybe financially they'd be ruined if there was change. All those kinds of people are pushing back against what we all accept as being wonderful, but it's still a fight and it's going to be a fight.
Uh-huh. Yep. Well, you've made a lot of change and done a lot for the industry starting from your days. I wonder where the industry would have been if it wasn't for you.
I, I, I can't really answer that, but
Uh-huh.
I will say I'm pretty happy, I'm pretty proud of having been there, let's say, at the inception, because a lot of what I was able to do, along with other people, come on, but we were able to seed the first and second generation of entrepreneurs that then went on to do the industry. So in my classes, there were a lot of folks that went on to become major milestones themselves in the industry. And I'm happy to have been with them and, be considered a part of the solar pioneers that got the whole thing going. But it's been the second and third generations after that that have invented new products, both technical and financial, have stuck it out through lousy relationships between distribution and manufacturers, and who have just gotten bitten by the solar bug, but not been hobbyists about it, right? It's
Yeah.
become truly mature.
Yeah.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, it seems like, how Forrest Gump saw so much change in his life and he was there for every big event. It was a real classic movie. I totally love that Forrest Gump movie. But you seem to have seen that kind of thing with the solar industry. I mean, it just like, how many fold has the industry grown since you were soldering together
Oh,
space
go back
cells?
to 1 megawatt in 1 year. How
Uh-huh.
many gigawatts do we make now?
Yeah, I mean, I almost wonder, like in 1973, how much solar was there in the world? There's probably
Oh,
some chart with that, but
kilowatts.
kilowatts. Yeah, there might be as much on my roof as there was in like most
I don't know. There were a
countries.
lot of satellites put up a lot of times, but and then we built Skylab and eventually the space station, but making Skylab was the first one that had the wings of solar. So we've come a long way. And you can talk about that, you can talk about the good old days or whatever, but I'm mostly just living in right now and excited by where we are now.
Yeah.
Don't worry about where we've come from.
Yeah, and with this kind of rate of growth that we have, and we always exceed expectations and beat whatever they think is going to happen, and we're going to get there. I guess the question is like, is it going to be 1 decade or two? And, it's just like we go from like 1 terawatt in the whole world in 2022, and then we're going to be 1 terawatt a year in 2030, they say, and we might beat it.
Yeah.
things are growing like crazy. And I was wondering too, like some of those cells that you were working on for space back in the early days, are they still up there? Do you think there's some that are still up there
I
orbiting?
can't say, I don't know. The whole idea of spending a lot of money on a satellite is that you want it to stay up for a long time.
Uh-huh.
So they certainly try to make them last as long as possible. Satellites with cells from the 80s, I'm not so sure. Maybe they've been replaced by, modern satellites with gallium
Uh-huh.
arsenide cells, and, I would imagine they've moved on. I don't know because up in space it's a different world. There's radiation.
Uh-huh.
Down here there's moisture and hailstones and crap like that, but there's moisture and corrosion that can occur here. Out in space, like I said, down here the concern is low cost. Up in space, the concern is low weight and
Hmm.
efficiency. And so when I was making them, every solar cell was covered with like an 1/8 inch thick piece of quartz glass. Every cell, each one,
And was
to,
that for
to be an
radiation?
absorber
Uh-huh.
for high energy particles
Uh-huh.
that would otherwise come crashing in and destroy the PN junction in the solar cell. And you put up a satellite and maybe its power would go down in 6 months
Huh.
without them. But with them, they would last for years. So
Well, I bet you some of your cells are out there circling me right now, whether they're working or not. We don't know for sure,
it's
but
nice
like
to think that way. Yeah. I'd like to talk about where I'm at now, where we've come from, Arco Solar, Siemens, AstroPower, through Echo Solar into Sun Edison. And then I've jumped over to an organization called Interplay Learning, which doesn't make solar cells. They do online 3D and VR training for the trades. They primarily came from HVAC. So you can imagine HVAC companies, Carrier, Train, using this training for technicians to virtually assemble, troubleshoot their HVAC systems. I joined them in 2016 and we created a solar curriculum. Now, we never really finished it. We kind of did version 1.0 of what we were going to do, but I was able to work with like my legs in two valleys. One was still solar, but the other was high tech training because besides my physics degree, I have a degree in instructional design. So my other love, my primary work right now, is in training and instructional design. And imagine how cool it is to create video lessons. Okay, so that's me doing my narration and explaining stuff, but then you step into a virtual world, either where you move a mouse and you move something on your screen, just like a first person shooter sort of simulation game, or you put on a headset, a VR headset, and you're in that room or on that roof or on that wall where you're mounting an inverter, and you're actually able to move your hands and follow steps and have it progress through steps, and then at the next level, take away the progression and say, okay, now perform the installation yourself. Imagine being able to create stuff like that.
wow.
And that's where I'm at right now.
Uh-huh. I've thought about like what you were doing with this too. It must be a lot of work.
Well, there's teams of people. I'm not a 3D simulation programmer, right? Considered, let's say, the subject matter expert on the topic, but I'd have pretty clear ideas on what I wanted to see and have be able to done. But there would be model makers who make 3D models and the programmers that work with the 3D software to make that all possible. That's a whole team of other people.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Because I've put on some VR goggles before, and I think one of them was like a safety training at the Carpenters Union. And I remember standing next to the edge of what was this virtual roof, and it was kind of scary, like I was going to fall.
Oh, completely.
And so it's super awesome, but compared to like just 2D, 3D is just like an infinite times more of things there are just like to put together. You can just go this way and that way and all these
That's
different
very, very
directions.
true. It's amazing, doing this work and, working in The Sims. The resolution isn't like in the movies
Hmm.
where, you put on the goggles and everything looks real and you don't know what's real and what's not. No, you can tell that you're in a simulated video world. However, the brain very quickly, maybe within, seconds, if not a few minutes, the brain accepts the world that you've entered into. The artificiality and the low res quality of it doesn't matter. And you're back to being like a real human being, learning the way a real human being learns, which is by being there and doing it, right? And the instructions are like having an instructor over your shoulder, but you can turn around, you can pick up a tool, you can turn it around in your hand, You can walk around the back and the front of a module.
Yeah, I remember what I did is I jumped off the roof.
Oh, you didn't go very far. Yeah.
I know, yeah. It was scary, but I knew where I was.
The power of this technology that we have now is it's like going from, overhead projector to DVDs or something. I mean, come on. We're entering a new world. We have AI as well that's everywhere and interesting. But in terms of training and learning, the ways that we're going to be able to train and learn are just fantastically more creative now than they've been maybe even 10 years ago.
Because when I put together my 2D videos, it's a lot of work. And I just couldn't imagine how much work it would be to go three-dimensional. I guess it's sort of like the experience too is sort of like living in a cartoon or maybe like Minecraft or some, my daughter does Minecraft and she's going from this room to that room and all these different things.
Yeah, well, there are programs and programmers that actually code all that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Maybe I'll get my daughter to help me with some stuff.
For sure. Oh, for sure. Come on. Yeah.
Get some Minecrafters. Do you play Minecraft?
No, I don't. I'm not really
Uh-huh.
good at video games. I've never gotten into stuff like that. It's funny. I've never have.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I know I've looked at interplay on the internet and seen some of that stuff, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Some of your stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's not with the Oculus goggles or whatever kind of goggles you're
No,
using.
that you're looking at a flat screen on a computer, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Well, that still is very cool. And
Yeah.
you can still stop, you can move around, you can move your mouse, you can be there instead of just like watching a passive video or going through a linear training lesson where it says, do this, now do this. You can go back, you can stop and look around. It just allows you to feel more present. And the learning is more visceral.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. So do you think that all education is going to go that way at some
No,
point?
no,
Huh?
no. I imagine going back to, Greece and learning from Socrates or from somebody else
Oh,
in
yeah.
one of those schools. The interaction of human beings, the energy that we share with each other, the instructor interacting with a classroom of people, the learners interacting with each other. I mean, this is all magic and human. These tools should be seen as augmentation of whatever else we can do. And the fact that we can do things in Zoom, maybe we can have telepresence so that instead of always having to fly to a different city every week and run a class, you can be in your studio and the learners can be in their studios. We have way more possibilities of keeping the human touch than going into a virtual world.
Well, maybe 1,000 years from now, you and I and Socrates will be teaching a solar class together
I
about some kind of technology that none of us know about.
think we'll be celestial beings that won't really worry about energy. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, it'll be something that somebody made of us, but yeah. Yeah. Well, that's super awesome. Well, maybe someday we can work together.
Yeah, of course.
Uh,
We're in the
yeah,
same trajectory, in the same worlds, of course.
great. Okay. Well, good.
I'm currently working with a group called Amicus O&M, and some people might be familiar with Amicus Solar. Amicus O&M, Operations and Maintenance, is its own organization, being led by Amanda Bybee, who's fantastic. And the key thing that we're doing here that is so timely is that Amicus O&M got a multi-million-dollar grant from the government to develop a workforce development and diversity training program that is focused on utility scale operations and maintenance personnel. Because now we have gigawatts of utility scale systems going in. They're built, they're installed, they're commissioned, and then somebody has to take over for the next 30 years. And so there's going to be a tremendous need for utility scale O&M technicians. And so what we're developing is a national curriculum for Tech 1 through Tech 4 level of that kind of work. We've already covered Tech 1. We're now in the process of developing Tech 2 courses. And it's super exciting for me because it's right where training needs to be. I mean, God bless residential installation. Let's carry on and keep going. But the gigawatts are going into utility scale, and that needs support or they'll start failing. And I'm able to participate from the instructional design point of view now. We have other experts that are already experts in utility scale stuff. But what we're able to do is to build a training program that, in a sense, we started at the end. Very cool. We started knowing that we didn't want to just run classes and have videos and PowerPoints and have people go through technician training classes either on their own or instructor-led, we knew that it had to be hands-on. We knew that we had to have performance-based competency, not just knowledge-based. Like to take a NABCEP exam, you don't have to show that you can handle a screwdriver. Maybe in some of the history in order to qualify you do. But it's a knowledge exam. But what we're working with here is kinetic learners. These are people that want to be technicians. They're not, interested in being in college. They're interested in being through a trade program and then launching out in the field. And so we're starting by working backwards and creating not only knowledge training courses of what we know they need to know about, performance, demonstration, hands-on assessments of, can you do this? Can you properly put on your PPE? Do you know how to put on your safety gloves? Do you know how to open safely an inverter? Do you know how to operate a utility scale transformer? That practical side of the training is there from the start. And we're developing field support guidelines so that individual O&M companies will have guidelines for how to field train and field assess their technicians, as well as a whole bunch of lessons for them to take on, subject matter. So we're now in a training situation for me that's exciting because we're dealing with utility scale.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I did hear some rumors about NABCEP having an O&M associate in the works or something like that.
Could be, maybe. We will be offering through the Amicus, O&M funded program, a national program.
Great. Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm kind of talked out if you are.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that was a great conversation. I'm so honored to know you and to have you here on this podcast, but just to have seen you around over the years. And I'm super honored that one time you showed up to my class when Bill Brooks and I were teaching a class.
For sure.
And I was like, wow, we have a really famous solar trainer in our class that's been
a potential
doing solar.
heckler.
Yeah, we love those hecklers. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for all that you've done in the industry. And you're great.
Well, thank you, man. I really
I'm a big
appreciate it.
fan.
I thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, honestly.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark Mrohs. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. To learn more, go to Solar, SEAN, that's solarshawn.com, and get yourself NABCEP certified.